Burt Reynolds had everything Hollywood could give a man in 1972. The looks, the charm, the box office numbers, the kind of effortless magnetism that made cameras love him and audiences trust him before he said a single word. He was at the top, genuinely, undeniably at the top. And then he sat down at a dinner table next to Bruce Lee. And by 10 o'clock that same evening, he had called his manager and canceled 3 films he had already agreed to make. His manager thought he had lost his mind. Reynolds told him he hadn't lost his mind. He had found something. Something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that made the 3 films feel like exactly the wrong thing to do with the one career he was going to get. What happened at that dinner table in 3 hours changed the direction of Burt Reynolds' entire life. And almost nobody knows the story. Until now. The man who had everything figured out. You have to understand who Burt Reynolds was in 1972. Not the later Burt Reynolds, the one who became a cultural punchline, the one people remembered for the mustache and the self-parody. The early one, the one before the armor went on. He was 36 years old. He had just filmed Deliverance, the film that would prove to the entire industry that he was more than a pretty face and a fast car. A real actor, someone who could carry weight, someone who could go to dark places and bring something true back. He was about to become one of the biggest stars on the planet. He knew it. The people around him knew it. The studio knew it. And with that knowledge came a very specific kind of pressure. The pressure of having arrived, of being expected to stay arrived, of making decisions based not on what was right, but on what protected the position you had worked so hard to reach. 3 films on the table, all of them safe, all of them commercially sensible, all of them perfectly calibrated to extend the career trajectory without risking any of it. He had said yes to all 3. Contracts pending. The kind of yes that you don't walk back from in that industry without consequences. He arrived at the dinner that evening having already decided his next 3 years. He left having decided nothing of the kind. The dinner and the seating arrangement that changed everything. It was a dinner hosted by a film producer, the kind of gathering that existed in a specific stratum of 1970s Hollywood, intimate enough to feel exclusive, large enough that the seating arrangement required genuine thought. Burt Reynolds arrived and found his place card. Next to him, Bruce Lee. Reynolds knew who Bruce Lee was. The Green Hornet, the martial arts reputation, the whispers from the industry about this man who was quietly becoming impossible to ignore. He had heard the stories, the speed, the philosophy, the presence that preceded him into rooms. He sat down with the mild curiosity of a man who expected an interesting evening and was prepared to be mildly impressed. That is not what happened. Bruce Lee arrived and sat down, and the first thing Burt Reynolds noticed, before any conversation, before any demonstration of anything, was that the room changed. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and explain, but something in the air shifted in the way it shifts when a window is opened in a room that had been closed too long. Reynolds would later describe it this way. Most people in that industry, including myself, walked into rooms carrying everything we wanted people to think about us. You could feel the weight of it, the management. Bruce Lee walked in carrying nothing, just himself, and it made everything else in the room feel suddenly very heavy. They shook hands, sat down, and Burt Reynolds, who had spent 15 years learning how to make any conversation work in his favor, found himself genuinely uncertain how to begin. The first hour, the conversation that felt normal. The first hour was easy, warm, almost deceptively ordinary. Bruce Lee was, as everyone who spent time with him noted, genuinely curious about other people. Not performatively curious, the kind of curiosity that is actually just waiting for its turn to speak. Real curiosity, the kind that asks a question and then actually listens to the answer with full attention. He asked Reynolds about Deliverance, not the box office numbers, not the industry response, what it had been like to make it, what Reynolds had found in that character that surprised him, what the experience had cost. Reynolds found himself answering honestly, more honestly than he usually answered those questions, because there was something in the quality of the listening that made performance feel unnecessary, like wearing a coat indoors. He talked about the fear he had felt making that film, the uncertainty, the specific discomfort of being required to access something real in himself on camera in front of a crew and a director and all the machinery of filmmaking. Bruce Lee listened, nodded, then said, "That fear is the most valuable thing in the room when you are working. Most people spend all their energy managing it. The ones who learn to use it instead, those are the ones you cannot look away from." Reynolds looked at him, said, "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me about acting in 15 years. Bruce Lee smiled, said, "It is not about acting." Reynolds asked what he meant, and the second hour of that dinner began. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The second hour, when the ground shifted. Bruce Lee talked about something he had been thinking about through the months of his back injury and recovery, about the difference between doing something and being something, not in abstract philosophical terms, in practical, specific, uncomfortably accurate terms that Burt Reynolds felt landing in his chest one at a time, like something measured and deliberate. He said that most people in any performance discipline, acting, fighting, music, anything where you are required to be fully present in front of others, spent their careers managing the distance between themselves and what they were doing. The distance protected them. It meant that if something went wrong, if the audience didn't respond, if the work fell short, they could locate the failure outside themselves. It was a performance that didn't land, not a person who wasn't enough. Reynolds was very still listening to this, because he recognized it, not as a description of other people, as a description of himself, as a precise and uncomfortably accurate map of something he had been doing for 15 years without ever naming it. Bruce Lee continued. He said, "The work that changes people, that stays with them, that they carry with them out of the cinema and into their lives, comes from the other side of that distance, from someone who has closed the gap entirely, who is not performing the experience, who is inside it completely with nowhere to hide." He paused. "It is the most frightening thing you can do in front of an audience, and it is the only thing worth doing." Reynolds sat with that for a long moment, then said very quietly, "The 3 films I just agreed to make, I would be managing the distance in all 3 of them." Bruce Lee said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The question that broke something open. Sometime during the second hour, Burt Reynolds asked Bruce Lee a question that had been building since the dinner began. He said, "How do you close the gap? How do you actually get to the other side of it? Because I've been trying, in the good work, in deliverance, in the moments that felt real, and I get there sometimes, but I don't know how to get there on purpose. I don't know how to make it reliable." Bruce Lee thought about this for a moment, not performing thought, actually sitting with the question before answering it. Then he said, "You are asking the wrong question. You are asking how to get somewhere, but the place you are trying to get to is not somewhere else. It is exactly where you already are. The only thing between you and it is the part of you that is watching yourself try to get there." Reynolds frowned, trying to follow. Bruce Lee said, "The observer, the part of you that stands slightly outside what you are doing and monitors it and adjusts it and protects it. As long as that part is active, you are managing the distance. The moment it goes quiet, not through force, not through technique, but through trust, you are already there. You were always already there." He looked at Reynolds directly. "The question is not how to close the gap. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to stop monitoring the closing." Reynolds sat back, looked at his hands, looked at the table, then said something that the host of that dinner, who had been close enough to hear fragments of the conversation for most of the evening, described as the most honest thing he had ever heard Burt Reynolds say. He said, "I don't think I do. I don't think I trust myself that much, and I built an entire career on making sure nobody notices." The third hour, the conversation nobody interrupted. It's about the honesty of that admission changed the energy between them. The rest of the dinner, the other guests, the food, the ambient noise of a Hollywood gathering faded to the background. Other people at the table sensed that something real was happening in that corner and had the instinct to leave it alone. For the third hour, it was just the 2 of them, talking about trust, about the specific and difficult act of trusting yourself enough to be completely present without the protection of management and distance and the careful construction of how you are perceived. Bruce Lee talked about his own journey, about the years when he had been technically extraordinary but had still been standing slightly outside his own movement, watching himself, adjusting, managing, about what the injury had stripped away, how 18 months unable to move had taken the watcher away, because there was nothing to watch, nothing to manage, nothing to adjust. Just him, just his mind, just the questions with no performances available to avoid them. About what he had found on the other side of that stripping, not a technique, not a method, a quality of being inside his own life that he had been circling for years and had only been able to reach when everything else was removed. Reynolds listened to all of it, with the specific attention of a man who is hearing his own life described from the outside and cannot decide if it is terrifying or liberating or both. At some point he said, "I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I think the best moments, the real ones, the ones I'm actually proud of, add up to maybe 2 films. Maybe. Everything else has been management." Bruce Lee said, "Then you have 2 films worth of evidence that you know how to get there, and a lifetime left to spend there instead of visiting." The climax, the phone call at 10 o'clock. The dinner ended around 9:30. People drifted toward the door. Jackets retrieved. Cars called. Bruce Lee and Burt Reynolds shook hands at the entrance, held it a moment, the kind of handshake that happens between people who have exchanged something real and know it. Reynolds walked to his car, sat in it for 10 minutes without starting the engine. Then he called his manager. His manager answered. "Late call," slightly alarmed. Reynolds said, "The 3 films, I need to get out of them." His manager said he was not serious. Reynolds said he was completely serious. His manager said there were contracts, commitments, real consequences. Reynolds said, "I know, figure it out. I'll pay whatever it costs, but I cannot make those 3 films." His manager asked what had happened, who he had talked to, whether he needed to sleep on this before making any decisions. Reynolds said, "I sat next to someone tonight who reminded me what I'm actually capable of. And those 3 films are not it. They are very expensive ways of spending time being less than what I can be, and I am done doing that." He hung up. The manager did figure it out. It cost, professionally and financially. Reynolds did not regret it for a single day, because what came after, the work he chose instead, the roles that required him to be inside rather than observing from outside, was the work he was actually proud of, the work that lasted, the work that, decades later, people still talked about as the real Burt Reynolds, not the managed version, the real one. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. What Reynolds said 30 years later. 30 years after that dinner, a journalist was interviewing Burt Reynolds about his career, about the choices that had defined it, about the moments of genuine decision. Reynolds talked about deliverance, about the films he was proud of, about the ones he wished he could take back. The journalist asked if there was a single moment he could point to where the direction of his career changed. Reynolds thought for a long time, then said, "A dinner, 1972. I sat next to Bruce Lee." The journalist waited for more. Reynolds said, "He said something to me that I had known somewhere, but had never let myself know consciously. He said the gap between who you are and what you are doing on screen is visible. The audience feels it even if they cannot name it, and they forgive it because most of what they see is managed, but they never forget the moments when it is gone. When someone is just there, completely there, with no distance." He paused. He was describing acting, but he wasn't talking about acting. He was talking about living, about being, about whether you are actually present in your own life or managing it from the outside. He looked at the journalist. That man died at 32, and he figured out something that most people never figure out in 100 years. He was completely inside his own life, not watching it, not managing it, living it, all the way in. He shook his head slowly. "I've spent 30 years trying to get to the same place, and I'm still not there. But at least I know what I'm trying for. Before that dinner, I didn't even know the destination existed." The moral hit, the question for all of us. Burt Reynolds spent 15 years building a career on managed distance, and he was extraordinary at it. The charm, the ease, the way he made everything look effortless, all of it was real skill, real craft, real achievement. And all of it was also a very sophisticated way of never being fully inside his own work, his own life. Bruce Lee saw it in a single evening, not because he was psychic, not because he had some supernatural ability to read people, but because he had done the work, the painful, stripping, 18 months flat on his back work of removing his own managed distance. And when you have done that work yourself, you can see it in other people, the way a recovered addict can see it in someone still using. The question this story leaves is not about acting. It is not about Hollywood. It is about the gap between who you are and what you present, between being inside your own experience and managing it from the outside, between living your life and performing it for an audience that includes yourself. Most of us have that gap. Most of us have built careers and relationships and entire identities on maintaining it because it feels safe, because it gives us somewhere to put the failure when things go wrong. Bruce Lee closed his gap, all the way, and the people who stood near him felt the result of it as something they could not name, but could not look away from either. The question is not whether you have the gap. You do. We all do. The question is whether you are willing to start closing it.